Hello everyone and welcome to another video. On occasion it happens that someone goes on a ride that is a bit too much for them and causes them to throw up the delicious lunch they've just had. That is unfortunate, but luckily it doesn't happen too frequently as humans are generally pretty good at avoiding that. The peeps in RollerCoaster Tycoon are a different story though, and they absolutely blanket your paths in puke if you don't hire an army of handymen to clean up after them. Why do they get sick so easily? How exactly does their nausea stat work? How do they get better again? And what are the effects of a high nausea value? In this video we will learn everything there is to know about the nausea of the guests in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 and Classic. It all starts with how they become nauseous. We'll look into the effects of it and how it goes away as well, but before that can happen, first it needs to go up. Nausea only goes up when guests go on a ride, so things like food poisoning or whatever do not exist in this game. When they enter a ride, the game calculates the nausea they will gain from it, which depends on a variety of factors. Some are very obvious, like the nausea rating of the ride and the nausea tolerance of the guest, but the other two are less obvious, and those are the happiness and hunger of the guest. The way these factors all come together to calculate how much nausea the guest should get is a bit complicated, and what is easy for computers isn't always easy for people to understand. Therefore, I'm going to present it differently, but obviously in a way that still leads to the exact same outcome. If you want to know how exactly the code does it, then you can find a link to it in the description. First, you take the nausea rating of the ride. This scales linearly, so a ride with 6 nausea will give twice as much as a ride with 3 nausea, and 4 times as much as a ride with 1.5 nausea. Since all the operations after this are multiplications or divisions, a ride with 0.00 nausea will never ever make even the weakest guests ill. The nausea rating of the ride is multiplied by a value between 12.5 and 39.0625, depending on the happiness of the guest. If they are very happy, which is 192 out of 255 or more, then they get the lowest value of 12.5. Then, as the happiness goes down, this multiplier increases up to a little bit over 39 when the happiness hits 56 or less. This influence of the happiness stat is a lot higher than I expected, as very sad guests get more than 3 times the nausea that a very happy guest gets. I guess that is another argument for keeping your guests as happy as possible. After this, the hunger multiplier is applied. Here it is the case that the hungrier a guest is, the less nausea they get. The logic is that if you are not hungry, that means that you have recently eaten and have a full stomach, which makes you more nauseous. In this step, the nausea value gets multiplied by a number between 2 and very nearly 4, as the maximum is 3.984375 or 3 and 63/64. If a guest has no hunger at all, then they get this maximum multiplier of nearly 4, and then it slowly decreases until their hunger status reached 128, which is halfway to being as hungry as possible. At this point, the minimum multiplier of 2 has been reached. After these two steps, the original nausea rating of the ride has been multiplied by a value between 25 if you get the 2 lowest and 156 if you get the 2 highest. Now, the only thing remaining is the nausea tolerance of the guest. This can be one of 4 different values: none, low, average and high. If this is none, then this is it. This is how much nausea the guest gets. If a guest has a low tolerance instead, then this is divided by 2, with average tolerance is divided by 4 and guests with a high nausea tolerance double that divisor again and divide it by 8. That means that as the nausea tolerance goes up by 1 factor, the nausea they get is halved, and guests with a high nausea tolerance are really quite difficult to get sick. This tolerance also affects which rides they want to ride in the first place, so guests with 0 nausea tolerance are thankfully unlikely to ride a very nauseating ride. I'm not gonna explain how that works here because I've already made a separate video about it, which you can find in the description. In addition to getting more nausea if they have a lower tolerance, we have seen that guests also get more nausea if they are unhappy, if they are not hungry, and of course if the nausea rating of the ride is higher. It's basically just 2 multiplications based on the happiness and hunger and then a division based on the nausea tolerance. One more thing is that after all 3 of these operations you have to round down to the nearest whole number. To make some sense and get a bit of intuition about how this works, we'll do some examples to see it in action. Here is a guest that is very happy, hasn't eaten in a while, so is fairly hungry and has a low nausea tolerance. The ride they're going on is this top spin with 5.74 nausea. Since they are happy, we multiply this by 12.5 and round down to get a nausea value of 71. They are also hungry, so this gets now multiplied by the minimum hunger value of 2 to 142. Finally, their low nausea tolerance divides this by 2 again to get us to a final nausea increase of 71. The nausea value goes from 0 to 255, so 71 isn't very much and will only cause issues when combined with other nausea increases. But what about this situation? Here, a guest with a neutral happiness of 128, no hunger at all as they've just eaten, and a nausea tolerance of none goes on a Giga Coaster with 2.86 nausea. This neutral happiness gives a multiplier of 25, which is quite close to the midpoint between 12.5 and 39. This gets us once again to a nausea value of 71, coincidentally exactly the same as we had at this stage in the calculation for the previous guest, even though the nausea rating of the ride is only half. That does nicely show the impact of guest happiness, as that halving of the ride nausea got completely cancelled out by the guest being neutrally happy instead of very happy. It gets even worse for this fellow though, as having a full stomach means this gets now multiplied by nearly 4 to a massive 282, and with a nausea tolerance of none, that stays 282. That is more than the highest possible nausea value, so no matter what they already have, it will just get maxed out and make them extremely sick. Had they been very happy instead, they would have only gotten 138 nausea, which is still below the value where their face turns green. So again, keep your guests happy. We'll do one more example to now show the power of a high nausea tolerance. This guest is the epitome of anger, has eaten so much that their stomach will be full until next week and will be going on the Space Rings, a ride with a high nausea rating of 6.5. That 6.5 gets multiplied by a little over 39 and then a little under 4 for a total nausea value of 1008, nearly 4 times the maximum possible guest nausea. But then their high nausea tolerance kicks in and it gets reduced to just 126 after dividing it by 8. That is still significant, but if they had no other nausea before riding this, then this is still not enough to make them puke. Oh, and if they are happy and hungry, then guests with a high nausea tolerance can ride a ride with a nausea rating of 12 and still only get a measly 37 out of 255 nausea. Man, these guys really have stomachs of steel, which, now I think of it, is a great name for a metal band. The way that the nausea increases after the game determines how much it should change is quite interesting. This calculation is done when the guest enters the ride, but it does not instantly jump to the new value. No, instead the so-called nausea target is increased instantly, and then the game slowly brings the actual nausea up to the target by increasing it by 4 every 3.2 seconds. That means that it can take a few minutes for the nausea to finish increasing if the guest got a lot of extra nausea from the ride. However, if the target has not been reached yet when the ride is done, then upon exiting the ride the nausea will suddenly jump towards that target. If the ride is long enough and the nausea reaches its target before the ride is finished, then the nausea will already start decreasing again while still on the ride. This technically means that extremely long rides will never make your guests sick. Well, not entirely I guess, as they do get nauseous, but if your ride is half an hour long, then the guests are guaranteed to have 0 nausea by the time it's finished. That's not a very viable strategy, but still fun to know. If a guest is sick, then you can see it on their face. When they reach 141 nausea, just over half, they turn partially green, and at 171 nausea they turn fully green and they really don't look very well. There is still one step further, as at 201 nausea their face will take another turn for the worst, and now they are trying their absolute best to not become a human mouth fountain. These faces not only look quite hilarious, but also come with their own thoughts. Every 25.6 seconds, a guest with 141 to 200 nausea, so one of the first 2 sick faces, will think that they are sick. Above 200 nausea with the very sick face, they will think they are very sick instead. When they think this thought, they will also go in search of a first aid stall, which is one of the ways to lower nausea. Before we get to first aid rooms though, we need to talk about the natural decrease. Every 12.8 seconds the nausea target will decrease by 2, which is the decrease that I was talking about earlier, as this also happens when they're on a ride. And actually this is the reason that guests are unlikely to ever get to the maximum nausea of 255. In the second nausea example, I said that the nausea of the guest would be maxed out, but if you look at their bar, it clearly didn't do that. That's because while the guest is still on the right and the nausea is still increasing to the very high target of 255, the natural decrease already kicks in, lowering the target before the nausea could ever get there. Only if the ride is extremely short they can reach the maximum, otherwise it will always be slightly lower already by the time they exit the ride. Not by very much though, as this decrease of 2 every 12.8 seconds is really quite slow, and a guest that is as sick as can be will take 27 minutes, half an in-game gear, to go all the way down to 0. That's a very long time, but there are ways to speed it up. The most extreme is puking. When a guest is walking around, then every 12.8 seconds there is a certain chance that they will throw up. If their nausea is 128 or less, so less than half, this chance is 0% and they cannot throw up. But above that, it slowly starts increasing to a 25% chance at maximum nausea. Doing the math shows that a guest that is forced to stay at a nausea of 255 all the time would throw up about once every 51 seconds. Besides the obvious generation of a puke puddle, throwing up also significantly decreases their nausea. It first divides the nausea target in half and then instantly lowers the nausea by 30. This guest has 200 nausea and can't keep it in. First their new target is determined to be 100 and then they instantly lose 30, bringing it to 170. Now the game brings that down to 100 at the previously mentioned rate of 4 nausea every 3.2 seconds, which takes just under a minute. That means that a guest that pukes will very quickly go below 128 nausea and be out of puking range, in most situations before they even throw up a second time. Vomiting also increases their hunger as they just lost their stomach contents. If they puke on a full stomach, then their hunger will suddenly jump from nothing to halfway again. Maybe you could use this to sell more food, we'll test that later. Puking also goes along with one of 4 different coughing sounds. This becomes an absolutely hilarious cacophony if you make thousands of guests sick at the same time. Music to my ears. It is a common myth that guests can throw up in litter bins or in toilets, but that is not true. Those have absolutely nothing to do with nausea in any way. However, what is true is that guests cannot throw up, or litter for that matter, when on a sloped path or an underground path. Well, actually they can do those things, but when they do, the puke or litter simply does not appear, which allows them to have all the benefits of puking and littering without any of the downsides. And that is great, because this means that in a completely underground park you won't need any handyman, saving you some money that you absolutely need, as building underground is very expensive. 2 other things that help lower the nausea are benches and, as previously mentioned, first aid rooms. Guests will not search for benches, but if they have over 170 nausea or less than 50 energy and there is a bench on the path tile that they are currently on, then they will sit down if there is space. Once sat down, their nausea target will go down by 6 every 12.8 seconds until it has reached 50. This is in addition to the standard decrease of 2, so sitting down will quadruple the speed at which nausea goes down. How long they decide to sit down for depends on their energy level. The lower it is, the longer they sit down. This leads to the funny situation of sick but energized guests constantly sitting down, getting up, sitting down again because they're still sick, getting up again, and so on. Since guests can puke starting at 128 nausea but only sit down at 170, benches near ride exits will not entirely prevent puke, but it will prevent a significant amount since it's the most nauseous guests that puke the most, and they now cannot puke as they're sitting down. First aid rooms are far more effective than benches. There are 2 ways for a guest to get into one. First, there is that very sick thought that guests with over 200 nausea get about twice a minute and sends them to search for the nearest first aid room. They cannot look very far away though, and they will only see ones that are within 10 tiles of them. Therefore, you should place these close to nauseating rides, and placing them halfway along empty stretch of path is quite useless. Guests will also enter first aid rooms if they happen to bump into one and have at least 128 nausea. There are ways to make it more likely for guests to randomly enter them, and we'll do some experiments for that later in the video. When guests are in a first aid room, their nausea will decrease by 10 every second until it has reached 35, at which point they'll leave. This decrease of 10 per second is much faster than the usual change of 4 nausea every 3.2 seconds towards the target. This is why the first aid room just changes the nausea itself instead of working with targets, as otherwise the game wouldn't be able to keep up. When the guys leave, they only have the tiniest slither of nausea bar left at this point, so it seems like it's lower than 35, but that's because the bar is empty between 0 and 32 nausea. An empty bar is 32 and the full bar is 255, so what you see here is the very small difference between 32 and 35. Not being sick is quite a good feeling, so their happiness also jumps up by 30 the very moment they leave the room. Actually, despite what I claimed at the start of the video, there is one other way besides going on rides that makes the nausea value go up, and that is carrying the name Mia Sheridan. If you name a guest Mia Sheridan, their nausea target is set to 200 every 12.8 seconds, and if their nausea ever goes below 130, it will be reset to 130 immediately. I don't know who this was or if she was even a real person at all, but she definitely got the raw end of the deal here. Although it's maybe not as bad as Felicity Anderson, who is apparently so ugly that everyone that is in her vicinity throws up. Damn Sawyer, what on earth did she do to you to deserve this? The name Melanie Warren also has an effect, as it instantly sets the happiness and energy to max and the nausea to 0 upon giving the guest that name, but it has no lasting effect after that. Okay, to summarize, guests gain nausea from going on rides, and how much they gain depends on the nausea rating of the ride, their happiness, their hunger and their nausea tolerance. After they have gotten sick, their nausea slowly goes down over time, but this can be accelerated by puking, sitting down or going into a first aid room. We'll look into how we can optimize this decrease soon, but first we should discuss all the effects of a high nausea value. Firstly, guests that have over 140 nausea will, in addition to getting a half green face on the guest window, also put their hands in front of their mouths and start walking twice as slow. This means it'll take them a lot longer to get where they want to go, although I don't think that has any significant consequences. It is mostly another reason to put the first aid room even closer to your ride exits. If the guest also has over 170 nausea, their sprite matches their big face and also turns green. It is quite funny to see everyone turn into a Hulk without muscles when you click the nausea cheat. Apart from this, there's a whole slew of things that guests will not do once they are sick enough. This starts at 120 nausea, above which they will not think that a ride was great. There are other variables that go into that as well, so they are not guaranteed to think it under 120 nausea, but they definitely will not think it above that. When they hit 140 nausea, they will also stop watching rides. You can sometimes catch guests standing still watching one of your rides, which is a calming leisure activity that is apparently not possible to do when your stomach is too upset. 5 nausea further, at 145, guests will stop buying food or drinks, which makes sense as most people would like to avoid all foods when they are sick. The final consequence of a high nausea value comes at 160. At this point, guests will not ride any ride with a nausea rating above 1.4. And to make sure this is not circumvented, they can also no longer immediately head for the same ride again when exiting it. Usually guests are not very sick for too long, as puking will take care of that even if you don't have benches or first aid rooms, so it's unlikely that guests are sick long enough for these restrictions to have a very big impact. Okay, now that we know how the nausea is generated and depleted and what effects it has, it's time to do a whole lot of experiments to see if we can minimize the amount of puke generated and make guests healthy again as quickly as possible. We'll answer questions like: how much effect do benches really have? Where should you place the first aid room? Does this affect how much food you sell? Those kinds of things. We will use this setup as the base for our experiment. There's a big beautiful twister coaster and a food stall, drink stall and toilet. Running this many times with every time a small change to the setup will teach us how certain things will affect the amount of puke and as an extension how many people are sick. To measure how much vomit is generated, I simply hired 2 handymen and checked how many puddles of puke they had swiped up at the end. The litter from the food and drink stalls will mess with this number though, so I disabled that type of litter to make sure that the handyman can only sweep up puke. Our first experiment will be on the nausea rating itself. How much puke do different nausea ratings generate? To make sure everything is the exact same every time, I will not build a different ride to get the desired nausea rating, but rather use a plugin to change the nausea rating of this very coaster, starting exactly at 1. Only the guests with the weakest stomachs will puke here, and after 20 years they have vomited just 389 times. A nausea rating of 2 almost 10 tuples that to 3578, and going up to 3 nearly doubles that to about 6400. This keeps going up until it reaches the highest amount of puke at 8 nausea, 13,669 in 20 years. After that it slowly goes down a little bit as the nausea gets even higher, but even at 12 nausea it's still quite a lot of puke. This graph looks roughly like what I would expect, but there are a few interesting oddities. First, it goes up as the nausea rating goes up. That makes sense, as a higher nausea rating makes the guests sicker. And it going down at the end also makes sense, as while a higher nausea rating does make guests sicker, at some point the guest with a low or even average tolerance will no longer go on the ride, as it's now too nauseous for them. So the average rider that goes on it can now take more. Why it's going down a bit from 6 to 7 is a bit less clear to me, but it most likely also has to do with guests that have a low nausea tolerance going on it less frequently. What I'm mostly surprised by is how much puke a ride with just 2 nausea can already generate, and 3, which is still very low for most coaster types, is really getting up there already. Interesting as this is, the real point of this setup is to see how we can cure sick guests in the quickest way possible. For all these tests we will use a nausea rating of 4, which generates quite a lot of puke and also allows nearly every guest to go on it. Only guests with a nausea tolerance of none and a low happiness will find it too sickening, everyone else will be fine with it. We already know the results of the 4 nausea test in the bear setup, which is 8,423 pukies. The first variant we'll test is just adding a bunch of benches, and for realism also 2 bins. This does lower the amount of puke, but not actually by that much. It only goes down to 6,453, less than a 25% reduction. And even though quite a number of benches are occupied by people consuming food and drinks, that is not an issue, as there are always free benches available for the sick. I guess benches are just not that effective at reducing nausea quickly. But what about first aid stalls? Well, those are a completely different story. With just one of them a few tiles away from the right exit, the puke goes down from just over 8,400 to 1,732, a massive 80% reduction. That is very good, but we can still do better. Guests are more likely to continue straight on at the junction if they are not heading for anything in particular, and we can use that to our advantage. What if we curve the path like this so that the first aid stall is straight on? Now guests that have between 128 and 200 nausea and the ones with over 200 nausea that haven't decided to get help yet have a much larger chance of going into it and getting better. The result? 50% less puke again, from 1,732 down to 857. But once again, we can still do better. I originally placed the first aid stall a few tiles away because it usually takes a little bit of time before guests start heading for it, so if you place it right next to the right exit they will need to walk further back once they decide to go for it. That is now no longer an issue, as with this setup we are mostly relying on people refusing to make a turn. Therefore, placing it right across the right exit should lower the amount of puke even more. And yeah, it does. We get another significant reduction from 857 to just 562. That is a massive 93.3% reduction. We only have a 16th of the original amount of puke. One thing that we are not accounting for here is guest happiness, and the guests are actually relatively unhappy in this test due to constant overcrowding. If I add 10 entertainers to alleviate that, then without a first aid stall the amount of puke goes down from 8,423 to 7,447. And with the best positioned first aid stall possible it goes down from 562 to 431. That's not because the guests get healed quicker, but rather because the happier a guest is the less nausea they get, so they're never getting sick in the first place. I think what this shows is that it's important to prevent things like overcrowding as much as you can, as in addition to all the other downsides, it will also lead to more sick guests and more puke. You could also not build food stalls and let the guests go hungry to prevent them from getting sick, but that also means they lose energy and happiness and are more likely to go home, so that's not a good idea. Okay, now back to healing the guests. What about a combination of a first aid room with some benches after it to catch the strays? This seems to depend on the situation. In this setup it actually leads to roughly a 50% increase in puke, probably because the guests keep getting up and sitting down again, and in that brief period that they are standing up, they have a chance to puke. It also doesn't help that once they hit 170 nausea, they will not sit down again once they get up, and also not head for first aid as they're now below 200, but they can still puke. Whereas if the benches did not exist, then they would just walk back to the first aid room and get healed. But when I tested this on a setup with a tiny maze with again 4 nausea, adding benches after the first aid stall suddenly did reduce the amount of vomit. And quite significantly so, by more than 50%, and I don't really know why these two are different. I think what we should do is test this in a real park, and also without any cheats like disabling food litter like I did for these previous tests. In this Six Flags Holland park I have added a bunch of bins to reduce food litter, and also added the first aid room to the exit of the 8 most nauseating rides, which is all rides with over 2.6 nausea. They are all in the most optimal position, except for Robin Hood, where there is no space for that and it's in a slightly less optimal position. Before we run this, we'll do a test without any first aid rooms. I ran it for 3 years and I needed 15 free roaming handymen to keep up with the litter. They swiped up a total of 2,192 litter and cost me 18,000 euros in wages. Then I also ran the experiment with the first aid rooms, for which I only needed 10 handymen to keep up, 5 fewer. They swiped up significantly less litter with just 557, a 75% reduction. It also saved me a few thousand euros. The 10 handymen cost me 12,000 euros over the 3 years, and the 250 euro construction cost and 45 euro yearly running cost means that the 8 first aid stalls cost 3,080 euros. This totals to 15,080, saving nearly 3,000 euros, nearly 16.5%. And there are other benefits too, of course. The guests are sick less frequently, which is always good, and there's also less puke on the ground, leading to fewer guests having their happiness lowered by standing in it. And of course there's also a smaller chance for vandalism to occur, as that is caused by a combination of unhappy guests and dirty paths. And now for the big question: does adding benches after the first aid rooms help? The answer is, it probably doesn't matter. I still needed 10 handymen to keep up with it, and they swept up pretty much the exact same amount of litter with 540 versus the 557 of the benchless test. Theoretically, you could probably figure out for which rides it's beneficial and for which it's not, but that will always change depending on like the path system and whatever, and it just seems like a massive waste of time to me. However, one thing that is sure is that when you add benches, guests will not go on as many rides. That goes both for benches used for nausea reduction and for ones used in food courts where people will sit around to eat or drink. That is fine if you charge for the park entry, but if you charge for the rides, then avoiding benches is probably the best bet to make the most money. The exception, of course, is if you have no first aid stall available, then using benches is your best option for reducing puke. One interesting thing that I briefly mentioned we would test for earlier is that adding the first aid room will also reduce food and drink sales. In the original setup, without a first aid room, we sold 7,842 burgers and 3,315 drinks. But when we did add the first aid room, we sold only 6,191 burgers and 2,558 drinks. That is because when guests puke, they get hungrier, causing them to buy more food. And eating food makes a guest thirsty, so it will also lead to buying more drinks. This is not worth it, of course, but it is interesting, and I could see this being a thing in a very specific puzzle scenario. In this hypothetical scenario, you would start out with a certain setup of rides and first aid rooms and have a shop and stall profit objective. And the only way to get enough income would be to remove the pre-existing first aid rooms. There is still a way to reduce vomit even more than we already have, and that is by doubling up your first aid rooms. In this setup we got 562 vomit after 20 years with 1 straight on first aid rooms, but what about second first aid? Now 75% of the guests will bump into the first one and go into it if they're nauseous enough, and of the 25% that don't, another 75 will bump into the second one. And yeah, this totally works. We went down from 562 to just 245, another reduction of over 50%. You can keep doing this, and with 4 first aid rooms we only got 186 vomit, but at this point it's really diminishing returns. And it's not like you can completely ditch handyman if you have no vomit at all. There are food stalls that do not produce any litter, but all drink stalls produce litter, so handymen are unavoidable, unless, as earlier mentioned, your entire park is underground. I think the second room is still worth it, especially on rides with a higher nausea rating like inverted coaster types and wild mice, but beyond that the handyman can deal with it. There is still one thing that I cannot explain. In the base test with the coaster we sold 7,842 burgers and 3,315 drinks. With added benches we sold slightly more food with 7,977, which could just be due to randomness, but the drink sales shot through the roof with 8,930. For some reason the benches near the stalls where they all sit down to eat and drink nearly triples the amount of drinks we sell while not affecting food sales at all. The conclusion seems logical. Benches allow guests to eat the food and immediately be thirsty when they get up, so they head for the drink stall. Solid reasoning, and it seems to hold up when we do the same test on this setup with the one tiny maze. We go from 4,000 drinks sold to 9,000 drinks sold by adding benches. But in this setup the benches seem to make little difference. At the original zero nausea of the 5 mazes, we went from 17,000 to 18,000 drinks sold when adding benches. And with the same cheated 4 nausea as all the other setups, we went from 25,000 to 32,000. That's still some difference, but not nearly as stark. I'm not going to dive deeper into this right now as this is a video about nausea, but it's definitely something I could explore in a future video. To summarize, guests gain nausea from riding rides, and how much they gain is based on the nausea rating of the ride and the happiness, hunger and nausea tolerance of the guest. Nausea slowly goes down over time, but can be accelerated by puking, sitting down on a bench and going into a first aid room. Of these, the latter is by far the best option, and the best location for a first aid room is directly across the ride exit so that the guests have a very high chance of going into it. Adding another one right after that is even more effective, but there might not always be space for that. Finally, guests with a high nausea value will reduce to do several things, such as buying food, going on nauseating rides and thinking that a ride was great. And that was everything you need to know about the nausea value of the guests. I hope you enjoyed learning about it, and you can click here to learn how guests determine which rides are too intense or nauseous for them. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.